How are we doing, Jimmy, for
live on YouTube just now?
yeah. I mean, we can just leave you to end the session after 18 minutes. Is that okay?
Sure.
You can time yourself. Okay.
Are we good to start?
Yeah, you've got about 45 seconds, but we're actually live on YouTube now. I'm just about to go live on Facebook just to share it to Facebook.
Please. And tell me when, Jimmy.
$20 seconds. 10.
Are we live on Facebook?
Yep.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Mick Napier, and I'm welcoming you to yet another Sunday afternoon broadcast, Sunday 60 Minutes, where we look at current affairs but try to go a bit deeper with guests to discuss some of the topics involved. This week, we've invited back Shir Hever, an Israeli economist and Israeli exile in Germany, journalist, to discuss the recent moves by the Polish government to prevent Jewish victims, Jews whose property had been pillaged during World War II, from recovering their property, and to look at the parallels and dissimilarities with the situation in Palestine, where, of course, the whole Palestinian people pretty much have had their property pillaged and are being prevented from recovering it. That'll be our first subject. After that, we'll take a look at the big news of the week, which was that wonderful Palestinian prison break. And although there's 4 heartbreaks since then, with people who won their own liberation being recaptured, 2 of them, as far as I know, still remain at liberty. And of course, the hopes of decent people around the world are with them, that they can avoid recapture and being recast into Israeli dungeons. Musheir El Farra, a great Palestinian from Sheffield, a family from Gaza, will be discussing that subject with one of our interviewers at 4:20. Finally, the great and the bad will be gathering in Glasgow in November for COP26 to discuss the climate crisis. And there will be a popular mobilization there in order to try to exert pressure on those world leaders. What they're leading us to is another matter. Joseph Schechla will be coming in. He is a worker with Habitat Land Rights International, and he'll be discussing the possible appearance in Glasgow in November at that assembly of the Jewish National Fund, a racist organization which is a pillar of Israeli apartheid. And that'll bring our interview conclusion just before 5 o'clock, and we'll make a couple of announcements about coming events. So without more ado, I'll deliver Shir Hever into the capable hands of Amina Abdel Khalik. Amina, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much again. Shir, we're delighted to have you back again today to hopefully discuss more about the subject that Mick has really just stated that you touched on very briefly last week. So briefly last week, you touched on a law recently passed in Poland that limits refugees who fled Poland to claim back property that was seized by predominantly Polish neighbours and later fell into communist hands. There's a personal connection here with you that you mentioned last week. Can you just explain some of the similarities or differences with this law and some of the arbitrary discriminatory laws that the Israeli government act out against the Palestinians with regards to reclaiming their property?
There are, of course, a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. Thank you, by the way, for having me yet again on this subject, which is so important and close to my heart. Just very briefly, I think the issue of the similarities and differences is worth mentioning because there are, in fact, 3 Polish laws which are which are blatantly racist but not openly racist, in the sense that they are designed to discriminate against Jewish people of Polish descent, like my own family. There is one law that says that Jewish people who have served in a foreign military between the years of 1948 and 1951 are prohibited from giving their Polish citizenship to their descendants. This is very clearly targeted at a very specific group of refugees from Poland right after the war, or the Second World War, that then served in the Israeli military, whether they wanted to or not. My grandfather is one of them. And then there is the second law, which is a law that criminalizes people from talking about and explaining the role of Polish people, non-Jewish Polish people in the Holocaust and shortly after the Holocaust in the murder and persecution of Jews. And this is part of rewriting of the narrative of history in Poland to say that the Germans are the sole responsible, the Nazi Germany is solely responsible for the crimes committed against Jews. And I would certainly say that Nazi Germany is more than the main responsible force there, but the complicity of certain Polish people, not everyone, of course, in the Nazi occupation, in the Nazi persecution of Jews, is something that you cannot talk about in Poland today. And the third law is the property law. It's an absentee property law, which is very similar and in many ways also based on the Israeli absentee property law. But here's the difference. In the state of Israel, there are far more than 3 laws that discriminate against Palestinians. But in the Israeli legal system, there is no attempt to use circumstances and to say a specific war would discriminate between one group of people and another. They just openly say that it's about Palestinians and Jews. And the absentee property law in Israel is a case where you have people who've lost their property during the war because they escaped. And then if they are not Jews, they cannot have it back. But if they are Jews, they can. And this is exactly the issue in Schechla, in the neighborhood in East Jerusalem, where you have Jews claiming property that they lost in 1948. There is a very small group of Jews who lost property in 1948. But some of them, or their descendants, people claim to be their descendants or their inheritors, somehow indirectly say, well, we've lost property in the war, we want it back. And then the court has to say, well, you know, there is the absentee property law, but it doesn't apply to you because you're Jewish. So the Israeli court is obligated to rule in their favor. So that's the big difference between the Polish case and the Israeli case, where racism is blatant in the Israeli case and also open. But in the Polish case, we all know it's a racist series of laws, but it's only because of the circumstance. And you did mention that my own family is involved. Maybe I should just very briefly say that my family is originally from Poland, from an area not far from Warsaw, and there is actually property that was left behind. The grandparents of my grandmother told me that she tried to convince them to escape when the war started, like most of the family escaped. And they said, no, we are too old to leave. We will stay here and weather the Nazi occupation. And of course, they were murdered. And what happened to their apartment? It was taken probably by the government, by the neighbors. We don't know exactly. And I want to say I don't make any personal claims on this. I have so many cousins and second cousins and third cousins who would all have a claim for that for that apartment in Warsaw, and who knows what happened to it during the war. That's not the issue. The issue is that the response that we see from not just the Israeli government, but mainly from other governments, from the British government, from the German government, to the Polish law is scandalous. And the reason that I've asked to bring this topic up today is because of the discussion that I'm seeing in the left, in the circles, in our family of activists in the solidarity movements with Palestine, that we fall into the trap of the right wing by saying there is a problem here with the Israeli argument. Yes, I agree, there is a problem, but what kind of conclusion we draw from it? And this is what I want to bring up. So 3 weeks ago, we had Salman Abu Sita here. I'll show his picture for a second. There we go. Okay. And Salman Abu Sita is a very respected Palestinian historian and cartographer, and he said very important things about the Nakba and talked about his own experience and the experience of his people. And of course, it's not my role to tell him what he can say about his own experience and his own people. But when he started to speak about the experience of Jewish refugees from Poland after the war, then I think he made a mistake. And that's what he said, for example, that it was the same people who lost their property in Poland after the war and who were the commanders of the Haganah, the Palmach, and other Jewish militias, Zionist Jewish militias in Palestine, who were then dispossessing the Palestinian population. That's not true. That's simply historically not true. Most of those commanders are immigrants from Russia and from other areas that came a bit earlier. And those refugees that came from Poland, they went all over the world. Most of my family that escaped from Poland after the war moved to the United States, to Canada, to Australia. Only a small part of the family went to Palestine. And then we have the Israeli government using this kind of absentee property law and Schechla, and we have people on the left saying, well, this is hypocrisy. And yes, it is hypocrisy. Absolutely. When the Israeli government says, we don't like it that Poland has a law that discriminates against Jews, but at the same time, they have a very similar law, and perhaps even on some levels, a much worse law, which discriminates against Palestinians, then this is hypocrisy, absolutely. But what kind of conclusion do we draw from this? That Jewish refugees from Poland should not be, should lose their right to the property that they had before the war? Because if you go through this logic and say they should relinquish their claims on that property, then you're also saying, well, maybe the Palestinians from Schechla or Palestinians from pretty much everywhere in Palestine who lost their property should also relinquish their property under the same logic. And I don't agree with that. And I don't think any of us should agree that Palestinians have lost their claim over their property. This claim is enshrined in international law. And even more importantly, it is enshrined in basic human decency. It's something that we cannot deny. So maybe it's worth mentioning that the Polish government are not idiots. They are very much aware that if they want to promote a certain right-wing legislation, it goes hand in hand with the issue of Israel. And when they see the German government saying, right now I'm a German citizen and living in Germany, and let's say that I would want to make a claim over that property that my family had in Poland before the war, the German government washes its hands completely of this. They don't care about their Jewish citizens. They say, oh, this is a matter for Israel. We are pro-Israel. We support the Israeli government. The Israeli government should deal with that, which is a betrayal of their own Jewish citizens. And I think this is something the Polish government understands. I'll show here a quick picture of Andrzej Duda, the president of Poland, who visited Yad Vashem. You can see him here in Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. You can see him here meeting with Netanyahu. And this is what he's doing in order to say, look, as long as my relationship with the state of Israel is good, with the Israeli government, then no kind of criticism can apply to my policies from any other country in the world. And that is a serious problem. And we should not accept that. And I think we should realize that this is actually part of one struggle for justice against the right wing, against the populist right wing, whether this populist right wing is in Israel or in Poland. It has similar goals. It is based on Islamophobic ideas, on racist ideas, on exclusionary and xenophobic ideas, also homophobic and sexist, and all of these regressive ideologies. And if you are progressive, if you're a feminist and you support human rights and equality in all its forms, then you have to equally reject Polish illiberalism of the PIS party, which is currently the ruling party in Poland, as well as the right-wing Zionist and populist right government in the state of Israel right now. Mm-hmm. It may be worth mentioning that Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister at the moment, has also addressed this issue. I can show a quick picture of him as well. I think we all know how he looks like, but just, and this is a picture of him when he spoke on the issue of anti-Semitism. And he recently made a very interesting and confused comment where he said, actually, all forms of racism are forms of anti-Semitism. It got that very much upside down. In fact, we should say that anti-Semitism is a form of racism and not the other way around. But he said that because he is also aware of the damage that was done by the former Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, when he forged this alliance with Poland, with Hungary, and with other anti-Semitic regimes in the world, by saying, I'll let these governments say they are pro-Israel and they will get a kosher certificate. And in exchange, we will support. They will give us some political support within the EU, for example. And Yair Lapid is saying, "Oh, this is a dangerous path to follow," because, of course, Jewish communities all around the world are horrified by this and cut their ties with the state of Israel, and they say the state of Israel doesn't speak for us, and we don't want to support the state, and maybe we should start supporting BDS and other forms of criticism against the state of Israel because they are making an alliance with these very dangerous regimes. So I think that's something interesting to see how Yair Lapid is trying to say we should build a coalition. He almost used the term intersectionality, although he didn't, where we should make one common cause with anti-racist movements around the world. But I'm sorry to say to Mr. Lapid that he's too late, because the anti-racist movements around the world are already very much on the side of the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And Yair Lapid has not yet been willing to take that step and to say, well, if we don't recognize the rights of Palestinians to live in dignity as human beings, then how can we expect anyone to respect our rights as well?
Yes, exactly. So you mentioned briefly as well the absentee property law in Palestine. I know it's not specifically your area of expertise, Shir, but I think you maybe know enough about it just to maybe explain to our viewers what exactly that means.
Yeah, well, this is actually a very economic law. So I did read the Israeli law and I did study it. Yes, this is a law that was enacted shortly after the 1948 war, when the Israeli government, which was very much involved in the pillaging of Palestinian property. We're talking mostly about real estate, but of course there is a whole section of research about various kinds of property that was stolen, like bank accounts and like books. But let me focus on the real estate issue right now, because that's where most of the money was. And they said, well, there is a problem here because according to international law, a conquering state cannot take private property over conquered territory. It doesn't work like that. And they used the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, in order to try to take over some of that property, but that was problematic, to say the least. So what they said is that all of this property will be given to a trusteeship. And the trusteeship will apply to the property of everyone who was absent on a certain date and that certain date, right after the end of the war, right at the beginning of the State of Israel's existence, where they chose a date where the maximum number of Palestinian refugees would not be around to be able to make a claim and register their land, their house, and keep it. Those who were not around to do it lost it, and it moved to a trusteeship. Now, the trusteeship is supposed to take care of their property and maintain it until they return. This is the legal language that is being used there. But it was understood from day one that there was no intention of giving that property back and allowing the Palestinians to reclaim their property. And in fact, the trusteeship has been used in a very non-transparent way through various means to gradually allow this property to slip into the hands of private owners, either indirectly through the JNF again, or directly through grants and that we're giving to new immigrants, new Jewish immigrants coming to Palestine. Actually, there is a piece of the diary of one of the first prime ministers of Israel, Musheir El Farra, where he says how much land he's giving to political supporters, people who support his political parties, using that Palestinian property to pay bribes to his political supporters. And that diary exposes it. So that, but of course, when historians used that diary and went to the trusteeship office to say, can we have any kind of record of what happened to this particular land or that particular land, then they said, well, no, you do not have access to that information. This is all secret. So this is the absentee property law. It applies only to non-Jews, and it says there that, of course, it doesn't say in the law that the law only applies to non-Jews. It says it applies to people who do not have a right to immigrate to Israel under the law of return. The law of return, not to be confused with the right to return, is an Israeli law that says that people who can claim Jewish descent can become Israeli citizens automatically. And that is the only official way for people to become citizens of Israel. Even people who are born in Israel but not born to Israeli parents cannot become citizens just by being born there. They can only do that if they are of Jewish descent. So this is something that is this is how the absentee property law works, and there are various economic estimates of how much money is involved. You know, the UN resolution for the right of return of Palestinian refugees also says that they should be compensated for any property that they lost. So it matters how much property we're talking about. And over the years, this property has gained a lot in value. It was developed, and now much of this property is really in the heartland of Israel, where the property value is very, very high. So we're talking about something in the area of $300 billion, quite a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that the laws you've just stated just go to show how overtly discriminatory and racist many of these laws Israel actually implement against the Palestinians. Well, Shir, that's us out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for coming back today. You're a walking encyclopedia, full of knowledge. We'll give you a break next week, of course, but don't go too far. And thank you very much again for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Amina. The big news this week was the amazing escape by 6 Palestinian resistance figures from the top security prison Gilboa, otherwise known as the Safe. Here to join us, I hope, if the technology works, I hope that Musheir and Tara will join me now. Where the devil is Musheir El Farra?
Can you hear me? I'm getting a message that the host wouldn't let my video work.
Come on, Jimmy, let him in.
The host has asked you to start your video. Okay.
Well, you can speak with Jimmy later.
I'm
here we go.
Ah, there
Thank
he
you,
is.
Jimmy.
Hello, Musheir.
So,
Hello.
friends, unfortunately, 4 of these heroic figures, these amazing figures, have been recaptured back into the dungeons. 2, I hope, are still on, still in freedom. Musheir El Farra is a great friend of, well, Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He's a very dynamic figure within the very dynamic Sheffield Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He's the author of When the Sky Rained White Fire, a bitter memory of particular wave of atrocities in Gaza. He's here to talk about, however, the bittersweet story of the escapees. And Tara McCarthy in conversation with Musheir El Farra for the next 18 minutes.
Thanks, Mick. Hi there, Musheir. It's lovely to see you today.
I'm
Thanks for joining me. We have limited time, so I'm just going to kind of crack on and just and ask you a couple of questions. I mean, I suppose it would be interesting for our viewers maybe to get a bit of an idea of what conditions are like for Palestinian prisoners in a prison like Gilboa. And maybe if you could describe a little bit more about the context behind the breakout in terms of justice for Palestinians within the Israeli legal system.
Well, the liberation, I wouldn't call it escape, of these 6 Palestinian political prisoners brought to the forefront the plight of the thousands of Palestinian prisoners inside Israeli jails, including over 250, 260 children and hundreds of women. And the conditions that those prisoners are subjected to are evident when we take 2 cases. There is a woman called Israel Jabis. She is sentenced to 11 years in prison. She's suffered severe burns, over 60% of her body. She's extremely ill. She's in a condition that she should be hospitalized all the time, but yet Israel is insisting on not releasing her. The other, obviously, case which we saw recently was another Palestinian woman called Dik, who was about to give birth, and she was kept in prison, and under a lot of pressure, they agreed to release her under house arrest to have her baby. The condition inside the Palestinian prisons are extremely awful. I'll just give a statement because it's important to give statements of prisoners, of a child called Muhammad Atta Zarour. Muhammad Atta Zarour was 13 years old. They arrested him. They put him, according to his testimony, they put him in a barrel full of cold water until he fainted. They picked him out, subjected him to a hose, very cold water, while the air conditioning is going on him. That's one of the means of torturing Palestinian children. It's a real scandal that international law. Once again, we say international law and Israel is above the law, but this is very particular. Prohibits the imprisonment of any person under 16 years old, and Palestinians have about 260 prisoners of under 16-year-old. Of course, the story of Dima Al-Wawi, 11 years old. I'm sorry, I'm giving names because we don't want to talk about prisoners as numbers. There are people. Dima Al-Wawi is 11 years old. Was 11 years old when she was imprisoned for 5 months, and her testimony gave you an idea about how they treat children, so you can think how they treat adults. She said to her mother, "Mama, they forced me to sign papers I couldn't read in Hebrew. They threatened me. I was so scared. I was so humiliated. I signed those papers." So that's the treatment of Palestinian prisoners, child prisoners. So when you go to the Palestinian adult prisoners, you can talk of all forms of torture, which is documented: sleep deprivation, waterboarding, hanging from the ceiling for hours and hours. Beatings, of course, all over their bodies. It's really shocking that the Israeli Medical Association has agreed to allow doctors to be in the torture chamber, to, if you like, to ensure that the torture wouldn't be shown to the world after the people, after the Palestinian prisoners are tortured. And I would like to remind the listeners of 12 or 13 years ago, when the Israeli High Court allowed what they called mild physical pressure. So it's mild torture, according to them. And in a very notorious, I don't want to call it famous, conversation between a British psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield and officials within the Israeli Medical Association, he objected to the torture, and one of the doctors said to him, and that's the testimony of Derek Summerfield, what the hell are two broken Palestinian fingers in return for information? This is the mentality of the state of Israel. This is the mentality how they treat the Palestinian prisoners. Of course, what happened over the last week was something that was amazing by every meaning of the world, and the fact that Israel, their pride, the Jalboa prison, which was built to like the same system as the British prisons, and it was designed by an Irish engineer who works for the British government. It was a big scandal. The fact that they re-arrested 4 is a shame, something we are sad about, but it was going to happen because those 4 came out with no support, nothing. But the support of the Palestinian people around us, the unity that was created by the escape, by the liberation of those 6 prisoners, was something that we will live and remember forever. It showed that how much Palestinians are longing for freedom, how much the Palestinians are thinking of their political prisoners. And it brings to us here the fact that we shouldn't shy away from the fact that those prisoners are not criminals. Those prisoners are freedom fighters by every meaning of the word, and we shouldn't shy away from this. And I'm very pleased that we reached a stage in Britain in general that we can stand in the streets, something we couldn't do in the past. Stand in the streets and call for the release of Palestinian political prisoners. I can say many things about the Israeli treatment of the Palestinian prisoners, and as I said, I concentrate on children, so that's an indicative of how. And I would mention, with your permission, I would mention, how on earth can you arrest prisoners' families outside? Those 6 prisoners who liberated themselves, their families, brothers and mothers, and they were arrested to put pressure. This is like kind of collective punishment. This is terrorism. What have the families done in the liberation process? They haven't done anything.
The injustice isn't just for
so they were in prison, they were mistreated,
places,
and when they were rearrested, that's something that people, I don't know if they caught it in the news, they were beaten up. They were beaten up viciously, and one of them is now in Rabban hospital getting treatment for his injuries from the beating that he received. So they are like portraying themselves in the world as a true living democracy. They are like subjected to the Palestinian so-called violence and whatever, and we just can't deal with this violence. We have to defend ourselves while they are committing crimes in terms of torturing prisoners, or in terms of administrative detention. I mean, there are Palestinian prisoners who have been there for months and months, some for years, without being brought to trial. And every time they reach the 45-day limit, they extend it and extend it and extend it, and the world is not paying any attention. And sadly, the Palestinian Authority as well is not putting enough pressure. Or in the past, when there was negotiations, these prisoners haven't done this out of being criminal. They've done this for the freedom of the Palestinian people, and no one should have any two thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the symbolism of the breakout to Palestinians generally in terms of their desire to be free from Israeli oppression. I think that our previous speaker, Shir, wrote an article earlier this week where he made reference to that. We'll post a link up in the chat so people can read it. I mean, undoubtedly, the Israeli government and the prison service have been absolutely humiliated by events this week. I mean, you've mentioned some of the direct reprisals when some of the escapees were recaptured. Do you think that there'll be wider reprisals as a result of this?
Well, they are now trying to recover from the humiliation and say that we caught those 4 in very fast, an abrupt, operation. But no doubt about it, they are going mad about it. And the reprisals, I don't know. The thing is, Israel is always attacking. I mean, Gaza was bombed last night and the night before, but because it's like sporadic bombing, it doesn't catch the news. Sadly, the media here is just like not interested. But Gaza has been under attack almost every week. Last night, the night before. So there is retaliation. Definitely, there is retaliation. But what as I said, the most interesting thing is the Palestinians are united in the support of the prisoners. They are hurt by the capture. I wouldn't deny it. They are very hurt and disappointed by the capture of these 4 political prisoners. But the fact that this brought it to the forefront is a lot of credit to those people. The fact that they have breached the most secure Israeli jail is a big insult to the Israeli criminal prison establishment, and it will remain as something that will be remembered for how people with spoons, for goodness sake, could breach such a massive secure prison, which is called the safe, because each cell is designed as a safe, as a bank safe. So
supposed to be
honest, credit to them. I think now a lot of pressure will be put on Israel about the Palestinian political prisoners, and those 6 in particular will be the first in any political prisoners exchange deal in future, because they captured the hearts and minds of Palestinians, and not only Palestinians, all people who long for freedom worldwide.
So you mentioned earlier about them, described some of the diabolical human rights abuses that are happening within these establishments. Could you maybe give us an idea of NGOs or campaigns that fight for the human rights of Palestinian prisoners, and maybe tell our watchers what they could do to support their cause?
Well, first of all, inside Palestine, Israel doesn't care about they don't care about the international law, United Nations resolutions. There are so many Palestinian and some sympathetic Israeli NGOs, which are on the left of the spectrum, who are working for the prisoners. Here, what I'm saying is we should really have the issue of the Palestinian political prisoner on our agenda, have the fact that Israel is breaching international law as another evidence, another example of what is happening to the Palestinian prisoners, really expose the judicial system that allows Israel to torture. It's a scandal if a high court says we allow mild physical pressure. It's documented. It's a scandal when the Israeli Medical Association sent doctors to observe interrogation in some cases. So these things must be told to the people, so that this image of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East who's under threat is challenged. And it's really extremely important that we do that. And I just encourage people in general not to feel, as I said, shy, because the issue of political prisoner has been always sensitive. People so-called blood on their hands or whatever. No, these people have fought for the freedom of their people, have fought, and they've been imprisoned, and they've been given sentences that extremely harsh. Actually, it reminds you of very, very tyrannical regimes with these. One of Mahmoud Arda, one of them is sentenced to 990 years in prison, for goodness sake. I mean, their sentences, their torture. I'll give you, before I finish, I'll give you one last example of a young 13-year-old called Osama Ziyarat. You should see the photo. I sent photos to go with my talk. Osama has external. This is an 8-year-old boy, by the way, 8-year-old, and look how he's treated. Osama, there is a photo with external fixation. They shot him in the chest. They shot him in the leg. They broke his leg. He needed external fixation. Another child as well. Another child. That's the boy Mohammed Za'arir, who I mentioned. They put him in a barrel. It's a scandal. But this particular one, Osama Ziyarat, this is Dima Alwawi, the youngest, who I told you they forced her to sign. She was only 11 when she was arrested. Look how young she is. This is the boy I'm talking about. 13 years old. They shot him in the chest. They shot him in the leg. Osama Ziyarat. External fixation. They kept him in jail for 4 months with his injuries. If that's not a criminal regime, I don't know what is a criminal regime. So these are the facts. We don't want to talk numbers. We want to talk to people with evidence. We want to talk to people with what we really, the truth, that is that we know it, but sadly, very sadly, the world doesn't know it. How on earth can a boy like that be a threat to the state of Israel? How on earth can Dima Alwawi be a threat to the state of Israel? How can an 8-year-old be a threat of the state? We had enough. We had enough of crimes committed against us, and yet we have to apologize for our resistance. No, they're creating hatred. This boy will grow up traumatized. Those children will grow up traumatized. Those children and others and hundreds who saw and witnessed in the neighborhood will be traumatized and will grow up to think of the world as an unjust one, and to reflect internationally, not only on Israel itself. Very sad.
No,
But we live and hope and continue to work, and justice will prevail one day. We never despair, and that is my message to everyone. Thank you so much. I think we reached. I save you saying it.
Well, I mean, Musheir, what can I say? It's incredibly a privilege to speak to you today. I think your the time that we spent together, brief as it has been extremely powerful. And you're right, we need to always remember to put names to these people and these experiences and share their stories, their experiences.
Absolutely, and their statements. And their statements. If you listen to Dima Alwawi, please Google it, Dima Alwawi, and listen. She said to Mama, my boots are full of mud. Mama, I'm terrified. Mama, I'm scared. A child appealing to her mother. This is what we want to, not out of weakness, but out of an evidence on the crimes that are committed against the Palestinians. How on earth can they imprison children, for goodness sake? Thank you very much.
Well, that's just come to the end of our time, Musheir. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you, Tara, very much. It's been an honor.
I'll pass you back to Mick now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Musheir. Thank you, Tara. Was the big story of the week. But the big story coming up soon is the gathering of the great and the good, or the great and the bad, in Glasgow in November. We're delighted to have Joseph Schechla with us today. Joseph is a founding member of Stop the JNF, but he's also an international human rights specialist with Habitat International, which doesn't sell furniture. It's a very important housing and land rights network in which they deal with not just Palestine, but comparable issues of brutal dispossession and violation internationally. Come on in, Muna. It's a great pleasure. We'll be seeing you in Glasgow in November, I very much hope. And Muna wants to have a chat with you up until the top of the hour. Then we'll have time for a few announcements.
Okay, very good.
Well, first of all, welcome, Joseph. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the programme today, and for you to perhaps educate us a little bit about what role or why the JNF has attained this observer status at COP26. Perhaps if you could explain a little bit about the background of that.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers, the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and of course, Stop JNF Friends, for this opportunity to speak to you. It's a pleasure to be had. I have the distinct honor to discuss something that is a very, very positive issue on our agenda, and that is climate change mitigation and protection of the environment. What's very interesting about the connection with JNF and the COP26 coming up, the much delayed COP26 coming up in Glasgow, is that you will not find JNF, Jewish National Fund, as an admitted organization to the conference. And a little bit of the background of that is that non-governmental organizations normally have, whether consultative status or special relationships with UN agencies, they have the honor, the privilege, the necessity, in fact, to take part in these global consultations. However, the last time that the JNF tried to attain that consultative status, it failed in 2007 on 2 counts. It presented its application to the NGO committee of ECOSOC, but was found that, number one, it's not a non-governmental organization, first of all, and because it is part of the state of Israel. It's a parastatal institution. It is statutorily linked to the state of Israel. Its leadership also have diplomatic status and diplomatic passports of the state of Israel. And the second reason was that the organization simply does not abide by the principles of the UN Charter, including human rights, non-discrimination, international cooperation, sustainable development, and peace and security. I mean, these are the kind of pillars of the UN Charter and its purpose. What was really interesting also in that time, even the United States was going to table a resolution having the JNF formally recognized in the full assembly of ECOSOC. But because these arguments were so compelling, even the United States did not try to assert its influence in ECOSOC. So JNF has no consultative status in the UN, and that's not just an oversight, and it's not for lack of trying. What you'll find actually in some of the publicity that comes out from the JNF is that they make, much noise about the fact that the JNF is actually absorbed into the State of Israel delegation. So they don't need to have observer status or consultative status. They are part and parcel of the state. And that's also one of the things that, disqualifies them to be in consultative status as a non-governmental organization compliant with UN principles. Now, that's just setting the stage. But we have, of course, we have to recognize, and I'll be very, very brief about this, the history of the JNF and what it means to the Nakba, to apartheid, and to the dispossession of the Palestinian people. As part of its persecution of the Palestinian people, its principal role is in the dispossession of the Palestinian people. And we have, of course, the World Zionist Organization, the first of these parastatals, and its sister organization that was found in 1921, the Jewish Agency. They're responsible primarily for settlement, that is colonization, using settlement, which is it's actually a professional term of physical geography and urban planning, which refers to, in neutral terms, any human collectivity. But settlement in the terms of the charters of these organizations is, in fact, colonization. Also significant about the charter of the JNF and the other institutions I mentioned is that it is founded on an apartheid principle that is enshrined in the JNF's case in Article 3 of the Articles of its Incorporation, designating the beneficiaries of its services to be those persons of Jewish race or descendancy. The notion of a Jewish race is, of course, enshrined in these parastatal institutions' charters, but also the very discrimination against all others is clear by its omission. It doesn't say we discriminate against the indigenous Palestinian Arab people, but we serve only that group we consider to be of Jewish race or descendancy. And of course, the Nakba in 1947-48 involved Zionist forces conducting 31 calculated massacres of some 50,000 or some 5,000 Palestinians and the destruction of well over 500 Palestinian villages. And this, in more numerical terms, amounts to about 154 to 156,000 Palestinian homes that were demolished in that time. That, of course, much of that effort was also funded by the JNF. JNF was the fund established in 1901 to fund the colonization effort, and that included the war effort as well. And it's also known for taking over the lands. In 1949, in January, the government of Israel conferred 1 million dunams of Palestinian refugee land and other properties to the JNF. And then in the next year, in October 1950, another 1.2 million dunams were absorbed into the JNF. And of course, we're reminded by spokespersons of the JNF at the time that explain why the JNF was the recipient of this property. And that is because the JNF's charter is explicitly for a unique group of people, that is people of Jewish race and descendancy. That's not to say that I'm supporting this notion of a Jewish race, but this is the ideological position of the JNF. And as the state of Israel or the government of Israel, it would not be somehow seen as legal in the international public eye to be discriminating as a government, a public government agency or institution on those terms. So we have, of course, the visionary Yosef Weitz of the JNF, early president of the JNF at the time of the State of Israel. He explained that the transfers of those properties to the JNF, quote, will redeem the lands and we will turn them over to the Jewish people, to the people and not the state, which in the current composition of population cannot be an adequate guarantor of Jewish ownership. So JNF, because of its charter, like the other parastatals, it ensures that this dispossession of the Palestinian people will serve exclusively the benefit of the colonial settlers. It's also important, I think, to note that JNF and the Jewish Agency and Histadrut, another one of these parastatal institutions, are the three that established Mekorot, which is the national water carrier. And by their charters of those three founding institutions, Mekorot applies the same discriminatory criteria. Why is that important? The designation of water resources is essential, of course, in this context. And JNF, why I say it's a positive story, because we're always told that JNF is really an innocuous organization. It's registered as a tax-exempt charity in over 50 countries around the world. And it's renowned for its reforestation programs. What was really quite interesting in the last days, well, in the last month, in fact, of August, and here I'm going to just show you another photo. This is what we see on the top. Can you see that photo?
No, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we've got
Okay.
it.
Much of the work of the JNF around Jerusalem, as you see in the reforestation at the top of the screen, shows what the outskirts of Jerusalem looked like in just before the forest fire that hit on the 18th of August. This same area, of course, was denuded by the fire, And what you see are the terraces of the villages, the Palestinian villages, and the agriculture, traditional agriculture of the time, before the JNF moved in to erase or upholster over the reminders of Palestinian culture and presence and its traditional agriculture in the region. And you see this, of course, in many cases all over Palestine, where the reforestation has been used as a means to, in fact, hide the truth about what had happened during the Nakba.
Well, could you actually,
Sure.
sorry to interrupt you, Joseph. I mean, I think you've brought up a very important point. And why are there, you've just alluded to it, but if you can talk to us a little bit more about why the JNF has done this huge, large-scale forest planting. You know, what is it that they are trying to cover up? I mean, obviously they've decimated villages, communities. As you said, we've seen the evidence now from the photographs that you showed us. But what is their agenda here?
Well, it's very interesting to see case by case. And if we look at, for example, the Yatzir forest that the JNF has been developing in the Naqab. This is an example of where great water resources have been dedicated, not to the indigenous people, of course, but to the irrigation of fingerling, little small trees, and implanting alien tree types in what is a semi-arid or an arid region. And the ideology behind this is to, in fact, enhance the environment, to increase rainfall, to allow the soil to absorb more water. What we're also finding is that the climate and the ecosystems where they're doing this reforestation is actually not able to sustain this kind of invasion of alien species. We saw that also in 2010, particularly in the Yatzir forest, but in other forests that are managed by the JNF on Palestinian refugee land, that during the 2010 drought, some of these lost up to 80% of their trees because of the drought. There isn't sufficient rainfall. They don't have the long-term sustainability. The saplings, of course, have to be irrigated, and they will not be generated. It's also, they won't be regenerated. And it's changing the flora and the fauna, and some rare species, including reptiles, are disappearing in this region. And there's a longer term objective that even the state of Israel and its foreign ministry are admitting, and that is to engage in climate diplomacy and to market the JNF as an organization that is going to help others, particularly African states in the Sahel, with a mega forest project that is going to somehow divert the jet stream from the Mediterranean down to the Sahel. I mean, there are lots of grandiose plans, but when we look at what has happened also in the unsustainability of these forests and the crimes that they were actually devised to cover up, it just becomes like so many terraces, a layer upon layer of falsehoods. And still, JNF is operating as a tax-exempt charity, and we've seen some references in the press to, for example, Tony Blair supporting a criminal charity. Well, it's a very interesting concept. It seems contradictory, but in this case, it actually is an oxymoron that is very much true.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I find it quite interesting that on the one hand, they're building all these forests, and on the other hand, the JNF has played a huge role in the deforestation of Palestinian lands and orchards. So if you could just give 1 minute on that.
Well, certainly now it's become more overt that the JNF, as of last year, has a resolution to openly invest in the West Bank. Of course, part of the precursor of the expansion of settlement, and especially agricultural settlement, is the desiccation, the uprooting, the extirpation of Palestinian trees, and other forms of repression against the rural communities of Area C. This is the area now where the JNF has announced that it's no longer going to be acquiring territory through a sister organization, but now outright acquiring more land in the West Bank as well. So there are many plans that are interwoven with the World Zionist Organization, the Mekorot, the Jewish Agency, and the State of Israel itself, and its military objectives, but also its population transfer objectives, which we shouldn't forget is a serious war crime and crime against humanity, prosecuted at Nuremberg just before it was carried out on grand scale in Palestine a couple years later.
So thank you. I mean, really, really interesting. We could talk for hours on this topic. Yes. And you're extremely knowledgeable. I think that what is it that we can do here in Scotland, in England, around the world? We can perhaps sign this declaration that has been advertised on Stop the JNF. Yes. To keep the JNF out of COP26. I think if we can encourage people to do that, it would be a great thing. So thank you very much, Joe.
Yes, we should expose all the contradictions that are laid out before us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in Glasgow in November, of course. Thank you very much, Joseph. And back to Mick.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, a big thank you to Shir, Musheir, and Joseph Schechla for intriguing and informative discussions today, and of course our three interviewers. Friends, a couple of quick announcements. What can you do, asks Muna. Well, on the 9th of October, Israel plays Scotland at Hampden, the National Football Stadium. And Scottish PSC will be joining with a range of partners, Scottish Palestine Community, Scottish Friends of Palestine, Scottish Lebanese Society, Friends of Al-Aqsa, many more, to give the Israeli football players, soldiers out of uniform, the welcome they truly deserve. Join us at the entrance where the football teams where the coach will come in for a major protest on that day from 3 p.m. outside Hampden. There's a major development happening in Scotland. The SNP, the governing party, the ruling party, are leaning upon a potential junior coalition partner, the Scottish Green Party, to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This bogus definition makes the discussions we've had today criminal or semi-criminal. Would certainly like to see them not take place. We need to stop more dominoes falling. Every major party in Scotland has adopted this bogus definition. The Scottish Greens have stood their ground so far and have an excellent position against colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and the crimes of Israel in general. We don't want to see that being toppled by pressure from the SNP. Go to our website and learn how you can how you can have a voice in this conversation. We do hope that the Palestinian resistance captures some Israeli occupation soldiers that can be bartered for the release of the 6th, and hopefully another 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Every Palestinian in the Israeli system is a political prisoner. None of them has had a trial, not just those on administrative detention. None of them has had a trial as we would recognize it. You can't have that in a system with 100% conviction rate in North Korea or in Palestine under Zionism. Friends, thanks for joining us today. A big thank you to our 3 guests. Join us next week when we'll look again at 3 topics currently in the news, but we'll try to go more deeply with distinguished guests and people who can contribute something significant to the discussion of how we can deliver effective solidarity to the beleaguered people of Palestine. This is Mick Napier on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, thanking you for joining us, asking you to join the campaign, asking you to turn up at Hampden, asking you to get in touch and help us to intervene in the issues of the day. We are a fighting campaign and we can raise our game only with your help. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.